Let's talk about storytelling. Storytelling has a rich tradition in stand-up comedy. Before there was stand-up comedy, there was storytelling in like caves and by campfires, and I don't know, probably some of them had houses. I don't know. Storytelling it's got a long, long tradition to it, and comedians to this day still tell stories in their acts. I mean, you can draw the roots right up to now. A lot of comedians tell stories the entire time. Some comedians tell stories once in a while. Some comedians don't tell any stories at all, honestly. And so if you like stories, you can absolutely do that. But if you don't like stories, you don't have to do that in stand-up comedy. It is useful, though, to know how to tell a good story. For one, so that you can make the decisions about what you do with your act based on your artistic choices rather than being filtered by what you can and cannot do in terms of skill. Build those skills, make the choice whether or not you want to do it. It's also useful to be able to do stories because it's life. You know, people like to hear stories. They like to be wrapped up in those stories. And that's one of those benefits that you get in a stand-up environment as well as outside of comedy. In stand-up, you tell those stories. The audience gets into the story. They immerse themselves. They transport themselves into the world of the story that you're weaving on a certain level. And it's hard to get that kind of immersion from other kinds of stand-up, just telling jokes or something like that. So stories are really useful for that reason, but they're also useful for more reasons. One, well, I guess number two on this list, is that stories are a safety net for jokes. If in your act you're just telling discrete, individual jokes, just joke, 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 right? That is, did I say discrete? That's probably not the right word. Distinguishable individual jokes. Each of those jokes is an event that the audience can identify as such. And if a joke doesn't work, the audience judges that event as, not so successful. It's not the worst thing in the world if you tell a joke that doesn't work. It's actually not that big of a deal at all. You can absolutely be in charge and a leader and make the audience feel comfortable. It's not a huge deal, and we'll talk more about how you can deal with jokes not working in another session. But suffice to say, if you tell a story, you might not even run into that issue at all because you told a joke, but you're also telling the story. There are multiple layers of entertainment happening at the same time. And so one layer is missing, but you still have that story. And the audience is still interested in that. And they don't identify that joke as the entire event because the event is still happening. And so if you get to a bunch of other great jokes and you have a great ending to that story, then the audience judges that event of the story as successful. And so it creates this safety net for your jokes. Also, if it's a plot point and a joke and the audience doesn't recognize the joke part, no harm, no foul, no negative yardage. They didn't even notice. It's like an entire band playing instruments rather than just one person playing instrument. You have all of these layers going on at the same time. And if somebody misses a note in the band, you might not notice at all. And you just keep enjoying the song. Same with stories in stand-up comedy. Another reason that stand-up gets benefits from stories within it is that stories are memorable for the audience. It's a lot easier for the audience to remember the stories, and therefore it's easier for them to remember you. And that's nice too. Better for growing fans and just having people enjoy you in the future when they think back at what you've done. It's also easier for you, the comedian, to remember stories. And the reason for that is that, one, stories are a linear experience, more or less, most of the time. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And also, they are, because they're linear, it's easier for you to remember what happened next, right? That's kind of drawing the line from A to B to C on that reasoning that I'm doing there. But also, they're longer. You might have a set that is, if you're doing a headlining set, that's like 45 minutes, right? And so if you're a one-liner comic, you might have to memorize 300, 400 one-liner jokes all on different topics, and you just have to pour over those jokes so that you can remember them. But if you're a storytelling comic, 3 stories, you're done. Way easier memorization-wise. There are some issues with telling stories, some obstacles that you'll run into too, and I can't just gloss over those. Those are worth thinking about. One is that if you embark on a story and for whatever reason your audience is just not into that story, it can feel a little not great to know that you have 2 minutes left of that story, 3 minutes left of that story. There are things that you can do to mitigate that issue. One is that maybe you have a shorter version of the story that you can do instead if you recognize that the audience is not totally on board. Another thing that you can do is what's called a save. And I guess I'll just tell you what a save is now. A save is when you acknowledge to the audience that you know that something didn't work, right? But that's not the only part of it, right? This is a recipe, what a save is. 1 is acknowledgement. You're aware that something didn't work. 2, you make the audience feel comfortable about that fact. It's not just acknowledgement, it's also letting them know how to feel. You feel fine about that thing that just happened, or you feel upset, but in a funny, not real upset kind of way. Or you feel like that mess up that you made that made that joke not work is funny, right? So you're conveying to the audience the emotions that you want them to feel, right? So awareness and, the feeling that you want them to feel. And then also, third thing and last thing for a save is you want them to laugh. This is comedy. So if you can say something that shows awareness, makes them feel more comfortable with that fact that a thing didn't work, and also you make them laugh, then you have taken that negative and you have turned it into a positive. I'm getting way off topic here, but that is a useful tool for whenever something isn't working. Anyway, so some issues with telling stories. Another problem that you might run into when you're telling stories is that getting them working in the first place is harder. It takes longer. When you're putting together a joke, that's difficult enough. I mean, it's a little puzzle that you're putting together, and it's complex, and you need the audience to make these assumptions and then feel surprised, and all of these other things need to happen for the joke to work. And we'll get into those necessary things later. I can't just do tangents this entire session. But all of that complexity, plus the complexity of getting the story working, is what goes into getting a stand-up comedy story working. And so both of those complexities on top of each other makes it so it takes a little longer to get your stories working. So those are some issues that you might run into with telling stories, but it's super useful to have stories. Outside of the stand-up comedy world, stories are also useful, like I said, but also like you're going into entertainment, and like maybe you want to write a script at some point. Maybe you're creative in a lot of different ways. Maybe you go to parties and, networking or something like that. Being able to tell a story, super useful in stand-up comedy and out. So let's talk about how to tell a good story. I am going to give you elements of a story. This is just the basics, right? And there are a lot of different recipes for stories. This is a basic recipe that works well. And if you find yourself writing a story and that story doesn't obey all of these quote unquote rules that I'm giving, that's totally fine, as long as that story works. But if you write a story and you're thinking, well, it's not really working, there's something wrong with it, or it's not optimal in certain ways, you might look back to these basics to edit and think about how you can improve your story. Okay, so let's get into the elements of stories. First, a hook. Your story needs to let people know that they want to hear that story. Because if not, then the story gets good, but the audience might not. They're not investing their full attention at that point. And the attention that they give might be a little bit more begrudging because they're like, they're calculating in their brain, am I interested in this topic? But the hook, the purpose of it is to circumnavigate that. It's to get them to already be interested in your story. And so think about what is interesting about your story. What's cool about it? What's exciting? What are the emotions that you want the audience to feel and that you felt in that story? What kind of utility is there in the story? Are there some lessons that are imparted or ways of reacting to the world that are useful? Those things are things that you want to imply or tell the audience that they are going to get out of your story. And those become hooks for your story. It's not limited to one. You can get multiple hooks that are all working, that are all making the audience interested in what comes next. You can add a curiosity gap. So you tell them, some fact that's crazy, and then they wonder how that could be true. And then you tell them how it can be true through the telling of the story. You can seed some mystery. You can do like you've seen this in TV probably, where like you start the show and it implies or tells the audience this crazy thing that eventually happens. And then the story backs up and goes to the beginning and leads the audience to how they got to that crazy event in the story. You can do a similar thing in your act. You can imply or tell the audience where it ends up, and then you can lead them to that thing. Right? And when you tell them where it ends up, you probably want to tell them something that's like close to the climax, but not the climax exactly, because that's a fun thing to reveal to an audience, the climax. But, each story is different. And so you may find a really cool, interesting, fun, funny way of doing different hooks in all sorts of ways that break the quote unquote rules of these basic elements. All suggestions. It's art, Next thing, setting. When you're telling a story, you need to get the audience to picture that story. And that's how the audience immerses themselves. That's how we put ourselves into that scene. And we can't do that if we don't have a scene to picture ourselves in. You know what I mean? So you have to give them elements of the setting so that we can immerse ourselves in the story that you're telling. You may not need to give them very much. This is stand-up comedy, right? And so concision's important, and getting to those punchlines quickly is important. So you don't want to tell them all of the details, like if the story takes place on a farm and that's relevant, then you tell them that it took place on a farm. But if the story was just you're talking to your friend, maybe you just say like, I saw my friend on the street. Whatever. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't have to be a farm. It doesn't need to, let the audience know that it was specifically a farm that farms corn, or that it was daytime or nighttime or whatever, right? You tell them enough so that the audience can picture themselves there, but not much more than that, right? Unless you can get those elements of setting to also do triple or double or triple or more duty. If they can have multiple purposes, then you can slip in more elements of setting so that you can get the audience to immerse themselves better, but also they're more entertained. And those other layers, the double and triple duty, I'm talking about, is the setting also funny? Or is the setting also something that contributes to the hook or the intention and obstacle, which we'll get into, or it leads towards the climax, right? So if you can get the setting to be those other things, you have a reason to include them. The next thing that's important for a story, and this is a very important thing for a story, because without this next thing, you don't have a story. You just have a list of facts. The intention and the obstacle. These two things that butt up against each other, that create that tension in the story. A character wants something, and something gets in the way. Identify those things in your story. And once you identify those, emphasize those as much as you can. Make those formidable against each other. Why did the character want this thing? Did they really, really want it? Were they really stressed about not getting it? If they didn't get it, what in their life would have been worse? And then that obstacle being in the way feels so much worse than it would have been. And why is this obstacle so bad? What is it that's getting in the way? And how big of a problem is it that it's there? And how hard is that thing to solve? Get those things to be strong, and the audience will care so much more, because that's where the tension and the emotion and a lot of that interest in the story often come from. So intention, obstacle, boom. Next thing to think about in your stories are the building towards the climax. We often tell stories to our friends because we are excited about the climax. Some event happened that was really interesting. And so we tell our friends and we rush towards that climax. But if you do that, if you just tell them the thing that happened, then you're missing an opportunity, because you want them to want that climax more. You want it to hit them as hard and as impactfully as it hit you. And so you want to lead them up to it, make them want that climax, build towards it, give them little seeds earlier, hint at this big thing that might be coming, or give some underlining facts that let the audience know, that contextualize that eventual climax as a bigger deal, as something more important. When you get closer to the climax and the audience starts feeling like that climax is coming, that might be an opportunity to dig into the moment a little more. Explore what your feelings were right before that climax. You can really slow down. Was there sweat dripping down your forehead? Were your fists clenched? Was the person staring at you in a way that was scary? What thoughts were racing through your head in that moment? Make the audience be on the edge of their seat, so that when you give them that climax, it's even bigger. It's even cooler. And by the way, while we're talking about these things, like emphasizing the intention and the obstacle, and building towards that climax, you might be thinking, but my story isn't that interesting. Well, it's interesting enough for you to want to tell the story, right? Or for you to consider that story. And these stories can be so much more interesting than they might initially seem. Like, you think about, let's take an example from outside of stand-up for a second. Steve Jobs, successful tech dude, okay? He had some trouble getting the tech working, all right? And then he got it working, success, okay? Just the facts of that, kind of boring. But there were movies that were good. They had tension. They had emotion. They had intention and obstacles. He needed that success. If he didn't get that, then that would be a huge problem. And, the things that got in the way were crushing for him. They made him just so upset. And we knew why, because if he didn't have those, then, his life would have felt like it was in shambles. He had that drive. And so the intention and obstacle made that story so much more interesting. And you can find those things for yours too. And also, you don't have to be on it. Like, this is theater, right? You don't need to be 100% truthful. You can embellish a little bit. It's okay to do that. You don't have to. I mean, you can be a totally honest comedian, but know that that's not something that the audience really cares that much about. You can, if they want to be entertained, they want a good story. So you can embellish. I wouldn't necessarily embellish past a certain point that you'll have to decide. Like, if you say that, like, you saved your troops in Afghanistan, but you were never actually in the military. Well, when the audience finds out, if they find out that that's not true, they might feel a little more betrayed, But if you say you went on a bad date, but that date was actually an amalgamation of like 6 different dates so that you could tell, a better story, combining all those facts, that's fine. That's okay to do. That's not a big deal. Okay? So we are now, I believe, at the climax. Tell the climax. It's pretty self-explanatory. You build towards that climax, you tell that climax. But that's not it. The story doesn't end at the climax. The story ends with closure. When you're telling a story to your friends, you get to that climax, you're really excited, you finish it, the story's done. And then your friends who are into that story will ask follow-up questions. And then what happened? How did that other person react? How did you react? What did you get from that? What are the effects on your life afterwards? And then you answer those questions for them, and then they feel closure. They like it more. They have more fun with that story. The audience in stand-up comedy doesn't have the luxury of being able to ask those follow-up questions. And so it's your job as the comedian to predict what they're going to want to know afterwards and give them that closure so that they enjoy that story even more. And if you combine all of those things together, the hooks, the setting, the intention and the obstacle, building towards that climax, the climax and the closure, then you've got a good story. And then it's just a matter of editing over time. All of this stuff is iterative, right? I mean, like I said, comedian that you've seen on TV, they're not doing that for the first time. They're iterating. And you'll do the same with your stories. Make it a little better the next time. Add jokes here and there. Find some places that you can make it even funnier, make it more exciting or something like that. And then over time, that story will eventually be just a darn good story. So something that you can get really good that first time, hopefully, but if not, you can build on it and make it better and better and better over the course of your many sets. Some other things to think about when you are writing your stories, practicing your stories, performing your stories. One is that as you write your stories, think about the implicit connections between the things. Earlier, I said that a story is linear because it's a series of events. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But that's not how you want to think about the writing of your stories. Because if it's just this, and then this, and then this, and then this, that's kind of boring. One thing just happens to be after the next. You want there to be some drive, some thrust from the last thing into the next thing so that the audience is propelled into the next thing. So this happened. Therefore, this happened. But then this happened. Therefore, this happened. Right? You see how that leads the audience to the next. You want that to be the rule of thumb for the beats in your story. Is the last thing driving the audience to the next thing? Okay. Another thing to think about with your stories is this is stand-up, and you don't need to have a very dense punchline amount. Like, it doesn't need to be a punchline every minute or every 30 seconds or something like that. But it's something to think about. The longer you go without a laugh, the more the audience might, depending on how exciting your story is, the more the audience might think, well, there's no jokes happening. And so think about, is it worth the amount of time I'm taking in between jokes? Like, is this story beat important enough that I shouldn't have jokes in here? Or that it's okay that I don't have jokes in here? Or should I add more jokes? I personally tend to err on the side of more punchline density, but not everyone does, and that's okay. You may have a more storyteller style that just leans into the story and has fewer but more meaningful punchlines within it. Either way is okay, but that is something to think about. Okay. Another thing to think about when you are telling your stories and planning for your stories is that probably your stories are going to have multiple characters. Not always, but probably. And when you are embodying those characters, think about what's going to help the audience distinguish between those characters. You talk like you on stage, or your persona, or whatever it is that you've picked for yourself, but your character probably doesn't. And you don't have to change your voice or change the way you stand or anything like that to embody that other character. But it does help often to do that. If your voice is a little different, if your character stands a little different, has a different facial expression, then the audience appreciates the polish, the thought that you put into that difference, that character that you're embodying, and it makes it a little clearer. It's a little easier for them to understand who's talking. And if you do that well enough, then you may get to the point where you don't even need to say, and then I said, and then they said, and then I said. You can just be those characters. Oh, and you also might want to block on the stage differently. Like, you are talking to this character, and then I guess I'm looking down, and then that means that your character might be a little shorter, and they're looking up and facing that direction a little bit more, right? That can be helpful for letting the audience know who's talking too. We are getting a little bit into the visual elements of storytelling, and that's something to think about too. You're picturing these things, and you may even tell the audience that those things are there, but the audience doesn't, they're working to immerse themselves, and you can help them need to work a little less if you gesture to where those things are. Like if you if you say in your story that you poured yourself some coffee, you might actually do that. And then the audience will picture where the table was that the coffee was on, and they'll picture the general size of the mug that you're holding, or if it had a handle, and they'll be able to cover that distance between them not being there for the story and them being there for the story. They can imagine themselves so much more easily if you gesture some of those things. All right, one more thing about storytelling that is just, it's so helpful if you think about this. It's that the feelings are the most important thing. So don't just tell the audience what happened. That's only intellectually interesting. But let the audience know how you feel, right? And if you say that you felt a certain way, that does a little, it lets them know that you felt a certain way. But if you convey that feeling, if you feel that feeling, you project that feeling, then the audience can feel it way better. They can feel those mirror neurons. And that is such a useful thing to get the audience to be immersed in the story, to enjoy the story more, to learn the lessons that you want them to learn because they are invested emotionally in the story. Thinking about the emotional content of your story is huge. So, what can you do to get the audience to invest themselves emotionally in the story? Conveying those emotions through your emotions is one way. Saying the facts that led to you having those emotions in the first place is helpful. It is sometimes helpful to tell them that you felt a certain way, but that's kind of a patch, that's something that you maybe you put that there until you think of something that actually makes them feel that way. But if you tell them, then you are saving time. There are no benefits to telling and not showing. It's a lot quicker to tell and not show. So sometimes it makes sense to do that, but think about the emotions, convey those for the audience.